all sides fancy.
Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Without Equal podcast. So Without Equal is the official podcast of Sine Pari, and I'm joined today. I'm Rob McQueen, your host, and I'm joined today by my co-hosts and co-founders of Sine Pari, Chris Perry and Steve Cargill. So today we're going to talk about commitment issues, and not something that's pretty prevalent in special operations, but we're going to focus on the other side of this, and we're going to talk about what happens when an organization and we're going to focus primarily on the military at this point, but when an organization has a decision made at the top level or external forces that are going to drive and create strife and challenges for the leaders that exist below that upper echelon. And we're going to focus on what those issues can look like. We're going to use the DoD's vaccine mandates as an example. And then we're going to really get into what we think you can do and what we've done and how our experience has led to dealing with those problems. Because often you're going to have to make things work when there's external forces that are driving you in a different direction. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I guess I'll start today and I'll dig into our case study and what we're going to look at. So right now, and I'm sure on the top of everyone's mind with the shift in the world and the last 2 years is COVID. And what we're facing inside of DoD is I think it's been going for about a year now, right? I think it started January of last year, is the vaccine mandate for all DoD personnel. So this has led to a kind of massive strife inside of DoD, where, in some cases, I think in some of the National Guard units, we're seeing up to 10% of personnel are refusing to take the COVID vaccine and are thus being what we call chaptered out or removed from service, right? I know there's a lot of personnel that are being barred from reenlistment, so they're not necessarily being kicked out, but they're not allowing them to stay for another enlistment. And you also have, I think, the most visible case of this is you have a large amount of Navy SEALs that are refusing to take the vaccine and are also being removed from service. So there's a lot that goes into this, and I think we're going to have to kind of talk through the DoD thought process. We're going to talk about kind of the thought process from higher. We'll talk a little bit about us and our experience with what it's like being in the service, because it's very different than being in just a normal company. And then from there, we're really going to look at what these kind of top-driven issues can cause and how to address it. So, Steve, I kind of want to transition over to you, man, and let's talk about kind of the attitude that we've seen from senior leadership. And I think between the three of us, we can kind of talk about that piece and rationalize that and let our listeners understand what that means and kind of add our own piece to it.
Okay, yeah. What I've seen is that senior leaders are within the military are truly following the archetype of adhering to the guidance and the order given by the civilian oversight, especially with this incident with the COVID vaccine implementation. And the idea is that it's another order, and just like any other order, you are to follow it. You see the idea that, if you were to be ordered to go to war, despite what your feelings might be regarding whatever land it is, whatever government we're opposing, you're expected to go to war. And so this is the same sort of mentality for a lot of the leadership out there, is that you have an order, there's a mandate from our civilian oversight, the President of the United States, and that you simply have to follow orders. And if you don't, there are consequences. There's the Uniform Code of Military Justice, UCMJ. And so there are provisions for dealing with what is being viewed as insubordination. And then also you've got the history of the military issuing vaccines and shots throughout one's career. At one's inception, there's several vaccines that you'll receive before you go into boot camp. And so they say, all right, you took those without question. What about this? What's the difference? And so there's a lot of these arguments that the senior leaders are putting forth to help with their enforcement. And so you have people that have their own mind with this situation, and despite those arguments, despite the tradition of adhering to civilian oversight, are still rejecting this mandate for many reasons. And we can get into several of those as we go along.
I think that's good. I think that sums it up, right? And a key part to understand is that, like, this is the way that the military operates. Like, you are given an order and you must execute. And that clarity and that understanding between the civilian world and military, I think, is really essential to understand as we kind of look deeper into this, which is, as this starts to go down, as formations start to lose people, and as you start to kind of understand that this is going to, just like it's driving in our country right now, that this is going to drive kind of a little bit of strife internal to the units. It's going to degrade commitment, and it's going to degrade that commitment to the mission. It's going to degrade that commitment to each other. And how do we as leaders, or how do the military leaders, the junior leaders right now in these roles, which I don't envy, like, how do you manage that and move forward? So, Chris, you want to jump in? And I know you've managed a lot of complex situation with teams and internal strife. I think this would be a good time to lend some of that to this and jump in on it.
Right. Something else that I wanted to address, though, is, the military writ large compared to the private sector is a pretty small percentage, but this is extremely relevant to the civilian sector as well, or everybody, because, again, the military does have that absolute hold over its participants, right? Private sector has a lot less of it. You didn't sign a waiver and a commitment and raise your right hand and everything when you took a job. So it doesn't take anything as serious as this vaccine mandate for people to start questioning their commitment to it, their commitment to the company, the corporation, what they're willing to sacrifice to stay a part of it. The military has a little bit less leeway, or military participants, soldiers have a little bit less leeway left and right to that. So in the civilian sector, I think it's much easier to encounter a problem that people may start leaving your organization, or you may start losing commitment from. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too, Chris, is because when you look at that as well, and when you look at the discussion around vaccine mandates in the private sector, there's the argument that, like, hey, if you're telling somebody they have to get a vaccine to keep their job, it's like, well, you have a choice. You could quit. Like, that's literally the definition of coercion, right? Like, do this, you get to keep your job. But in the military, it's not coercion. Like, you signed on that line. Like, I have signed away my rights to be a private citizen, i.e., you own me. And if I don't follow your rules within, like, the guidelines of lawful orders, then there are legal ramifications for that. So I agree. Like, I think that this is probably a more complex issue to deal with on the civilian side. But I also think it's more of, I think that the mission and structure of the military, that I think this is actually a bigger issue, because instead of just worrying about, like, finding another employee, building another team, and how do you manage, like, the manpower issues that this causes, or the legal issues as a business, now you're looking with, like, how do I manage and maintain people in a life and death mission set with this type of complex strife inside of the organization.
Right. And so part of it is keeping a finger on the pulse of your organization, whatever it is, civilian, private sector, military, is how do you understand how far you can push your people, or what they're willing to commit to, and what's going to be the straw, that breaks the camel's back, or that makes people that is just too much for them to handle. So that gets into really understanding your people and continuing to reinforce the motivation, continuing to reinforce the commitment to your organization that's going to survive through those difficult times. So it's a complex scenario that I think we're seeing play out, not just in the military, but in the private sector right now.
That highlights an excellent point, Chris, in that you simply cannot generate commitment in an emergency. Commitment is a long, slow burn by a leader and an organization to develop that tight-knit thought that I am a part of this organization. I belong with these people to my right and my left, and I have a purpose within this organization. It's not something that you can create in an instant when there's something that comes down the pike that has a negative effect on that cohesiveness of the element. And so with that, what we're finding is that perhaps there wasn't all that much commitment to begin with for a lot of these people that are deciding to move on. And then that also highlights another issue for the military in particular, is that you cannot generate force in an emergency as well. So they're highlighting for themselves that they have a deficiency in the commitment, which then leads to a problem with with their readiness for when there is an emergency conflict wise. And so how do you deal with that at the upper echelon? That's a good question, but we're talking further down the pole.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've shaped this pretty well, and I want to kind of transition this conversation. I think everyone understands the issue that we're discussing, right? That we figured out the top-down driven problem that COVID's caused a ton of them in today, but now we can really drill it down a little bit, and let's look at how do we start to deal with and shape this problem. So, Chris, you had a good point. You're like, hey, keep your finger on the pulse of the organization, right? So I think a key part of that is how do you gauge the commitment of your people? And then also inside of that, keeping your finger on the pulse is important. So let's start with how do you gauge the pulse of your people, and then some good kind of things or tricks you've used to really be in tune with what's going on in your organization.
Right. You really have to pay attention. You have to consider commitment or trust to be a fluid environment, right? Little things can cause break in someone's. It can cause someone to doubt a little bit. You have to pay attention to what's going on with your organization, understand your individuals, their motivations, really dig into what it is that does motivate them or why they are committed to your organization. Continuing to reinforce that commitment, continuing to find things to keep them engaged in your organization and your company, and in military organizations, this applies writ large. So it takes trust in your subordinate leaders, understanding the leadership tenets of how you get the investment out of your people and how you dig into their personal individual motivations. As we've seen before, I think I've talked about it before on here, going into combat versus garrison or the non-combat environment that the military calls it. People will willingly put up with certain things in a garrison environment where it's safer because they're more concerned about promotion, or they're more concerned about, the survivability or the Maslow's hierarchy, as we've talked about. Some of the more base needs are being met, so they're willing to put up with a little bit more. So leaders get a false sense of the resiliency and the commitment of their organization. But when shit hits the fan, as it is, if you find yourself in combat, people may not be willing to put up with faults in leadership or lack of belief in the system as much, because their fear of bodily harm and death are prevalent, right? So that changes people's commitment. So that's an example of a stressor that would change the resiliency and the commitment, the trust of your organization.
Yeah, and as you've maintained those needs for the need to belong and esteem needs, when that emergency comes down the pike, what you need to do as a leader is simply be transparent. You need to objectively lay out, what are the benefits to being in this organization, and with the expectation that they'll far outweigh the negative aspects. But it's really that relationship that you've built over time that will be the deciding factor, and that the emergency will be that test to determine whether or not that's been good enough, really.
That's a really interesting point, Stephen. And how do I want to unpack that? Because really what you're saying is that if you haven't built relationships with your employees up to that point, then you have no idea what's going to happen. You're really kind of the catastrophe hits, and you just got to hope that everyone's on the same page, or things may fracture. And kind of go a little bit more into that, because I think that's a critical part. And then I kind of want to jump in on it too, because I have a little bit of a vignette, a personal story that I think ties into that part.
Yeah, so the expectation, at least for me as a leader, is that from the beginning that I have been putting together an environment that's welcoming, where everyone wants to be a part of that, and where everyone understands their purpose, and we're all working towards that same goal, so that way everybody wants to be there despite any adversities that they may face. And so when these emergencies like this COVID mandate comes down the pike, you just need to be objective and transparent. And so one of the things too is that commitment is a two-way street. You have commitment to unit, you have commitment to your subordinates and your teammates as well. So you have to balance that. And of course, the commitment to the organization is going to be the thing that wins out, but you can maintain a balance to some extent with that so that you give your teammates and your subordinates a fair shake. And so you got to objectively lay out what their options are and try to provide them the best avenue for them at this point, because they're going to make their own decision, as a grown individual and somebody who has their own equities to deal with, a family to provide for. And so you just need to be fair and objective with them in order to provide them the best avenue for them.
So I think that's an interesting piece, because you've talked about, and you really hammered right there, like, hey, if you don't have that personal relationship commitment to the organization is what you're going to have to drive, right?
Yeah.
I want to shift this conversation a little bit, because I think we've hit that, right? You got to keep your pulse on the feeling of your organization. If you don't have that relationship, like, there's not a chance for that commitment to relation, or that commitment to a personal base, like that personal commitment. Then you're going to have to rely on the commitment to the organization and be transparent, lay out what that is, and just do a cost benefit analysis, and then it's up to them. But I think really a challenge with this is, where do you sit as a leader when that commitment to the organization is degraded, and you're kind of balancing the two as a leader, right? Like, I'm asking you to do something that I may not personally believe in, right? I'm asking you to do something that is a requirement that we have to do. But I'm trying to maintain the personal relationship and commitment we have to each other as a leader and a subordinate. At the same time, I know that the commitment to the organization that is asking you to do these things may be degraded. So for me, in kind of a personal story to this, is prior to my deployment to Bosnia, we were going through our medical readiness, our prep to go. And somehow in my previous deployments, I just never gotten the smallpox vaccine. Like, and you guys know that's the thing. Like, you go to Iraq, you get smallpox vaccine. You go to Afghanistan, you get smallpox. Somehow, I just had never gotten it. And so I'm 2 weeks out from leaving on a nearly year-long deployment to Bosnia. And I'm going through this piece. They're like, well, hey, you don't have your smallpox vaccine, you need to get it. I was like, well, it's not on the country card. It's not, like, this is not an important thing for Bosnia. It's a live virus vaccine, or like a pseudo live. I'm not a doctor, so I couldn't tell exactly what it is, but you have to cover it up. Like, it's a nasty thing for like almost a month. And the side effects to it that are listed are pretty big. And one of them is, like, it has some pretty huge impacts on the sexual performance of the male. So you have some impacts there, and it also has a negative impact on the the ability, if you're trying to have children. At the time, my wife and I were trying to have our third child. And so I was like, hey, man, like, this is not required for the mission. Here's the Department of State stuff. Like, I think this is ridiculous. Like, let's just move on. He goes, no, this is the rule. This is what it's going to be. You're going to do it. And so I'm 2 weeks out, grab my commander, who had a really good relationship. I was like, hey, sir, what's the deal? And he's like, I'll take a look at it. We'll get it done. And he did everything he could. And the answer was no. The answer was just straight up no, right? Like, this is what you have to do. So this is the mission. This is the job. This is what the Army is asking you to do. Do it and move on. And so I did it. I moved on. And the last 2 weeks before this trip were absolutely just shit between my wife and I. Like, the side effects came through with, like, on point. It ruined my wife's last night 2 weeks together. We were unable to even try to have kids prior to leaving. So this was a huge impact on my personal life, right? And so now at this point, like, I've given a lot of time to the military. I've deployed multiple times to combat. And now I'm like, this is ridiculous. The icing on the cake, and what really pissed me off, and why I have I have a lot of sympathy for the guys that are trying to stand up for what they believe in on this and what their perception of the vaccine may be, is because I got to Bosnia and I'm doing my medical and processing with the embassy. And the lead nurse there is looking at me and she's like, is that a smallpox vaccine that's not closed yet? I was like, yes, it is. She goes, and she's this super smart, like, nice Bosnian lady. She goes, what the fuck? She's like, why did you do that? Like, that is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. And so I'm sitting there and I'm looking at the medical professional that's in charge of this, the medical professional that follows the Department of State, this entire thing. And I realized that the bureaucratic organization that was supposed to look at me as a weapon system, right? And it's supposed to manage men and mission together, right? Had been so stuck in its processes that all it cared about was fulfilling the check on the block. That doctor that was doing the thing at the medical processing did not care about me at all. Did not care about anything but checking the block on that process and move forward. And so for the beginning part of that the beginning part of that mission, one, I'm dealing with the wreckage of my life with my wife and me leaving for a year, which is tough anyway, but then what that vaccine led to in that time frame. And then two, I'm dealing with, like, in myself, a loss of trust in my organization, because I really felt at that point, I was like, I was literally betrayed. For what reason? So at that time, that was really tough. And it made me, I think, less effective for a little bit. I moved past it. We moved on. Everything was fine. But that still resonates to me as an important piece of this. So I understand, like, I am not making a comment on the COVID vaccine at all. I want to make that really clear. But I understand the thought process where, when you look at the amount of media that is going around this, how guys can look at this and be like, I don't think anyone in here actually has my best thought about me and my best thought about the mission. Because, when you're talking about 200 plus Navy SEALs being removed from service, you got to look at it and be like, so what's the cost benefit analysis here? Like, and what is the impact to the force as this trickles down, and how, as a leader, do you mitigate this massive thing? I mean, just from the contracting world, I think there was a stay on the federal mandate, on the mandate for federal contractors. So now we're running into a system where the contractors that left because they didn't want to get the vaccine mandate are now coming back. And now you're running into conflicts with the people that stayed are now like, well, why do you get to come back and get your job? Because I stayed and got the vaccine and you didn't. So now we're running into that system of that degraded piece. And now that the fact that mandate has gone away, you're running into more issues. So I think I went on a little bit of a tirade, and a little bit of a run. So I apologize. I'll dial this back in. But I do want to get to that part. Like, when you hit this type of scenario that is happening across the world, and you're losing your employees, and especially with DoD, your service members are losing faith in their ability and their commitment to the mission in the organization. How, as a leader, do you manage that and move past it? Like, how do you do it at this level? Because it's challenging and it's hard. And I think it's beyond just understanding the scope of what's going on in the organization. Like, do you take a hard stance? Do you connect with the person and say, hey, this is what it is, suck it up? Or what do you do?
Yeah, it's definitely challenging. And so I think that, you as a leader need to make your decision as well, because you're one of those many that are affected by this. And so are you going to remain with the organization, or are you going to be the one that takes a stand as well? So you could be a part of the group that decides to not go along. So once you've made that decision, then I think you can more clearly determine what your focus is going to be as a leader. But if you're a leader that's going to stick with the organization, I think a lot of what you need to do is, like what I described previously, be objective, be transparent. But also, too, you need to highlight, getting back to basics, what is the purpose of us being here? And, make sure that everybody understands their purpose, and say that, hey, in order to achieve this purpose, this is just another one of those stipulations that you have to go through. If you don't believe in that, then, well, there are options for you. Unfortunately, they have consequences. As all actions have consequences, it's just determined, the difference might be is there's negative and there's positive consequences. So you make your own choice is what you need to do. And so by being honest with your constituency, with your unit, your people, I don't think that they could ask more of you as a leader. But in order to try to maintain that cohesion, you just try to say, hey, you've got brothers and sisters to your right and to your left that need you to be here. Can you be here for them? And that's a decision that they need to make.
Right. And Rob, two of the things that you really hit in your story there was with the leadership was competence and humanity, right? Is that the organization is looking out for me and making decisions in my best interest. And then also that they're making intelligent, well thought out, smart decisions, the right decisions, right? Those two things kind of resonated with me in your story. And so that's when you assess your organization, you have to look for those things. And if they're not there, you have to make an effort as a leader to emphasize the humanity and the competence of your decisions.
That was really good, man. I think that's a really good point. I think that's where, because I think looking back on that, like, I left that feeling that my leadership had done everything for me, right? So my faith in my leadership wasn't really broken. My faith in my organization was degraded quite a bit, right? My commitment to both. But I had a commitment to that leader who'd asked me to do a job, and I knew he put himself out there to support me the best way he could. So I think that's it. Like, you can as a leader, you have to support people to the best of your ability. But in the end, you're going to look at some things that you just cannot move as a leader. And you're going to have to reach out, be empathetic, talk to the people and respect their peace and try to support them the best you can. But Steve, to your point, at some time, you're going to have to take a look at something and be like, look, here's the hard facts. I can't make this decision for you. You have to make it yourself and just kind of go from there.
Hey, Rob, I think you bring up a good point too, and to try to build the resiliency in whatever organization you're in terms of a problem set like this. I think that you need to develop commitment on multiple levels, developing commitment to the organization, developing commitment to the leader, developing commitment to those to the right and left of you, developing commitment in self and in the mission. So if you've got that multi-tiered commitment in place, that's a lot of commitment to be broken if you're going to make a decision that extracts you from that position and from that organization. So that's a really tough sell on any one individual for any emergency that pops up. So that just makes it a little bit more difficult for someone to leave because of how important they've identified themselves as being as a part of this element.
Right. And identifying the factors that you can't affect, and then identifying the factors that you can affect, and emphasizing those and building the commitment and the resiliency to the things that you can affect. Right. And that's different for every situation, but ultimately you have to take a step back and look at the data, look at what's coming down, what you have control over, and try to emphasize commitment to the things that you do have control over.
I think that's a huge piece too, is as a leader, you focus on what you can control and you try to mitigate the impact of the things that you can't, right? But you can't ever mislead or step away from your subordinates and give them the impression that you can control things that you can't. I think you have to be really clear on, hey, here's what I can do and here's what I can't. That transparency is huge. And I think as a leader, you end up spending less of your time spinning your wheels and dealing with stuff that you can't affect if you really do just focus on like, hey, here's the 3 things that I can manage inside my team or my organization. And then we're just going to have to people are going to have to make their own decisions on the other side of that. Yeah, it's a challenge. Like this is a tough scenario. And I think it has a little bit of a personal piece to me just from the issues I had before. But I think this is a tough scenario when you're talking about getting people to make a decision about their own health that has an impact on their work. And that's a challenge and that's tough, especially in today's information environment, which is just an absolute utter shit show. I think we can all agree on.
Well, right. And when it catches people off guard too, right? I mean, nobody knew the pandemic was coming, et cetera. So a lot of organizations are completely unready to handle this. And a lot of people had no idea what the commitment or the resiliency of their organization was. So I think it's important also to continually test that, and not in a bad or a negative way, but continually assess how with it your people are, how committed they are to the organization. And you do that by challenging your organization. And, anything. I mean, from an engineering perspective, we do, a stress test and you see what breaks first, right? I mean, you don't have to test it to the point of failure necessarily, but you can start to tell what needs improvement. And so continually monitoring your organization, your leaders, your personnel in that way is important.
Absolutely. That was fantastic. Yeah, I think I think we've nailed that one down. I think that was good. Again, with commitment, I think that we could spend, Steve, just on what you closed it up on with commitment, we could easily go back into how to build those different echelons of commitment. I think we should at some point. But just, it is one of those topics that is so essential as a leader to understand and to be able to build that I think we could talk about it in perpetuity, realistically. But let's do it. Let's go around the horn. I think we're at a good place to kind of tie this guy up, unless there's any closing comments. Because Chris, I like what you said, and I think that put a good bow on it, man. So, Chris, I'm going to pass it over to you, and then Steve for your final thoughts, and then we'll close the sucker out.
Sure. No, and this is our best, the 3 of us, this is our best shot at these. They're super complicated answers that I'm sure people much smarter than us are confounded by some of it too. It's a continual process. It's a learning process, just as leadership in general is, right? Exposing yourself to more stuff. So, I think it's been interesting talking about it. We certainly didn't solve the problem. Hopefully we gave some people some insight, or at least some, insight into our minds or some of our experiences. So. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, so long as you keep mission first, people always, and making sure that their best interests are in mind when you provide that honest, unbiased, objective feedback and guidance and so on. That's what's going to really build trust over time. So that's what, I've relied on in order to get those who I've been surrounded by to follow me. And that's what I continue to rely on in this current emergency. So, that's all I can impart, really.
I like it. Well, hey, thank you so much again, Rob, Chris, and Steve, founders of Sine Pari, and your hosts here at the Without Equal podcast. Follow us and subscribe on any of the podcasting platforms: Spotify, Stitcher, Apple, all those good ones. We're also available on Rumble and YouTube if you want to watch the full video piece of this. And if you will take it, if you really want to dig into leadership and really focus on growing as a leader, take a look. Follow Steve or Call Sign Fancy's blog on cinepari.com. And if you get the chance, come on out and take one of our courses, and we'll help you shape who you are. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll have you out here listen to us again soon. Cheers.
Cheers.